Everybody, I'm James Suter. I'm delighted to be speaking with you today. I'm really keen to hear some of your thoughts and questions on a piece of research that we're doing at the University of York in collaboration with the Office for National Statistics, Tube NHS Trust, amongst others, Strathclyde, King's College London, etc. The Suppport2Work project aims to understand the role and the impact of employment advisors in NHS talking therapies. This is a large-scale project that is funded through the NIHR, the National Institute for Health and Care Research. It's one of the first major independent studies that look at how talking therapists and employment advisors support patients with mental health difficulties around their work and employment. And on the next slide, I'll talk you through a bit more about how we're going to approach that. So the model of care for talking therapies is you normally go to your GP and with a mental health difficulty, and you would be referred into the talking therapist service. And as part of that, employment advisors were introduced into the service to work alongside talking therapists to help patients and service users gain employment if they're out of work, or retain employment if they're struggling at work, or to return to work if they're off on long-term sick. EA's employment advisors were introduced in different areas throughout England in different stages. So they're now rolled out across the country. And there are a number of different service models for this. There are many services that are now in-house. So within the NHS talking therapies, they employ their own employment advisors. But amongst other services, these are outsourced. And we'll be looking at a range of services, whether they're insourced or outsourced from the NHS. Our research questions are, it's a qualitative package, so we're looking at how EAs make a difference, if they make a difference to supporting service users to gain work, retain work, or return to work. And if they do make a difference, we're really interested to find out why and who they make a difference for and how they make that difference. So as I said, we'll be conducting qualitative interviews. We're sort of rapidly approaching about halfway through our data collection now, and we've already got some fantastic and really interesting results that Levana is going to talk you through in a moment. We are looking at 12 talking therapy services across England, and we've got a mixture of urban and rural services, as well as these different service models, whether they're insourced or outsourced. And amongst those 12 talking therapy services, we'll be speaking to the service leads, senior employment advisors, the frontline employment advisors, and therapists, as well as 4 to 6 service users. So overall, that'll be 60 service users across the 12 different sites, around about 48 employment advisor staff, and 12 therapists. And we are conducting some really in-depth qualitative interviews with them. They're lasting about an hour and a half, looking at, for service users, looking at their personal backgrounds and their journey into talking therapies and into the employment advising service, so how they're referred, the kind of support they get, how that interacts with any therapy they're getting from their talking therapist. And importantly, what the impact and the outcome has been of that service on our service users, and why they think it's had an impact, and where they are now, so whether they're in work, or whether they've returned to work or gained employment. And similarly with the background, we'll be looking at their personal backgrounds. We're finding that staff come from a variety of different backgrounds before becoming employment advisors, how they deal with referrals and assessments, and looking at if there is a typical service pathway for their service users, with a particular focus on those 3 groups of service users: those who are out of work, those who want to retain their work if they're struggling at work, and those who want to return from sick. And we'll be analysing that by looking at the qualitative themes across the interviews and really sort of digging deep into people's journeys through work. Can I have the next slide? I won't talk too much on this slide other than to say that we have targeted 12 NHS sites, and they're all, 2 of them are complete now, 6 are live and ongoing. We're collecting data in them, and 4 are still in the setup stage. And in terms of interviews, we're rapidly, as I said, we're rapidly approaching halfway through our research. I am going to pass you over to Levana, who is now going to talk us through some of the emerging findings for the project.
Thanks so much, Jane. So yeah, I'm going to present some of our emerging findings that we've had from the interviews we've done so far, but I just will obviously caveat by reaffirming what Jane has said, is that field work is still ongoing and analysis is at a really early stage. It's brilliant to be able to talk to you in this session and hopefully get some interesting questions and feedback that's going to guide the analysis going forward. So what I'm going to present today is talk through some of the circumstances that we've found that people are in prior to seeing an EA, talk a little bit about what does that employment advisor support look like, what are some of the different outcomes we're seeing from people that use the service, and also those limitations and barriers to potential positive outcomes. So in terms of people's work circumstances prior to receiving support from an EA, the reason why people wanted employment advice support was incredibly wide-ranging. For those people that were in work, we haven't found much of a distinction between those who were in work and going to work at the start of receiving support and those that were signed off sick. Many people who were in work and working had periods off sick, so we sort of grouped that group together here. And these group of individuals reported very challenging circumstances going on at work. Some of them were going through grievances, had experienced discrimination, were at risk of redundancy, and also others reported experiencing bullying at work, difficulties with management, workplace pressures and stress. And some, especially our younger interviewees, reported that their job didn't align with their career goals or experience. And others talked about low confidence around workability. Now, for those people that were unemployed when they started receiving support from an EA, they were experiencing lots of challenges connected to their unemployment, including financial issues, low self-confidence around finding work, and often this was linked to experiencing many rejections. So the sort of job seeking had sort of reinforced their low confidence around work. Some reported judgment, or that they perceived that there was being judgment from family members and friends about their employment status. Others were in quite challenging local labour markets, especially people we interviewed in rural communities. Others also described how they had quite unstable job histories, including disruption by COVID. What we also found is that for our unemployed service users, they had often experienced the challenges that the in-work participants also experienced, but had since left work, maybe as a result of these issues, maybe as a result of other issues since then. So as well as dealing with the challenges around unemployment, there were also, some of them were still holding on to those difficult experiences that had happened to them in work, and that was still impacting them. Now, importantly, people's challenges were not just related to work at all. We found lots of contextual factors that were impacting people's mental health and work, and this was described by both service users and staff in terms of what were some of the challenges that were coming into their appointments. I've not this list here is certainly not comprehensive and is not in any sort of list of how often this happened, but just to give an indication of some of these challenges, people reported experiencing long-standing or fluctuating mental health. Others had learning disabilities or were neurodivergent. Others, quite a few people in our sample reported physical health needs, and often for that group, the physical health had sort of those challenges had led to poor mental health. We had quite a few people talk about how caring responsibilities were impacting them. There were also mentioning of difficult relationships breakdown, as well as custody proceedings, insecure housing, social isolation and bereavement. And this quote here on the right-hand side, I think illustrates how these issues around work, but also wider circumstances and mental health can really stack on top of each other and create really, really challenging circumstances for both the talking therapists to deal with, and also the EAs to support in terms of work. So this young man, he describes how he always thought of himself as mentally strong. He left a job where he wasn't getting on with the manager, and his mental health started to deteriorate. He then went on to a fixed-term contract one summer, but then he found out during that fixed-term contract that his friend had died. He describes how after that he spiraled for months. He was catatonic, he was a mess, and he also talked about experiencing suicidal ideation. On top of that situation, he was now unemployed and having to navigate that, and he describes experiencing rejection after rejection from jobs, and then this difficult relationship with his dad, not thinking that he was trying. So it certainly isn't the case for everyone that we spoke to, but it's an illustration of how complex these circumstances were when people were seeking support. Now, in terms of the employment advice offer, it's challenging to put it into a couple of slides in the short period of time that we have, but what we've done here is sort of pick out 5 key components that we're seeing in terms of what the EAs are delivering. Like Jane mentioned, we've been really fortunate in the talking therapy services that have agreed to speak to us as part of the research, and we've managed to speak to a real range of different service structures and different communities. And what is clear is that there is quite a lot of flexibility in the employment advice offer, and it is delivered in different ways. Whilst the core model is one-to-one casework, there is clear variation across the different services, and that can just start with something as the number of sessions that's on offer, which seem to range between 6 and 10 in the interviews that we've done so far. So one of the most key things that we have found, and this is across the staff and service user interviews, is that the EAs offer a personalised service. The support is very much client-led and tailored to what that individual wants support with. One of the things that we found is that in people's employment status doesn't necessarily dictate the type of employment support that they want to receive. So, for example, people who are in employment might not be looking to retain or return to work. They might be looking for a new job, and the EAs are in a position to be able to respond to that. Another key component of the service is that it is completely voluntary for people to take part. And this sort of non-pressurized offer of support was really important to service users. As well as that, EAs talked a lot about how the motivation of service users was important for the service to be successful. So people wanting that help and taking on that advice was really important to successful outcomes. What is also clear about what the EAs are able to do is that it's not outside of employment support. There is this clear emotional well-being dimension to what they're delivering. People described how their time with the EA often allowed them to have sounding board in a space where they felt listened to. And what EAs talked about, or quite a few of our EAs talked about, is that they are focused on helping people find work that is good for them, that is sustainable, and is, going to lead to potential recovery. The practical and advice and support that is offered by EAs is incredibly wide-ranging. These really are experts in job searching, retention, and return to work, and they pull together quite a lot of different skills. And like I said before, they might be moving between retention support, so doing things such as reasonable adjustments, negotiating with employers, to job search support within a single case, and they're able to do that because they've got this wide range of skills and experience. What they're also doing is advising on or signposting to services for holistic issues that impact on work capability. So signposting people to debt services, benefits and housing services, and also referring or putting people in touch with training providers and volunteering opportunities. A key sort of unique thing about the employment advice service is this connection to therapy, whether they're based in physical, whether they're co-located with therapists or not. EAs are working alongside therapists and supporting people on this journey. And this is going to be a sort of key area that we really want to dig into with the research, because what we are seeing is quite different relationships with the therapy teams, and we really want to explore that and see how that pans, and see what comes out of that sort of avenue of research. So in terms of employment outcomes, as you might imagine, by the diverse range of issues that people are coming to EAs with, we saw a broad range of employment outcomes. And again, these didn't necessarily stack on to what their employment status was when they were coming into the service. So across each of these different employment statuses, many people moved into a new job. Some people moved into a main job, and now that new job could be a desired job that they wanted and matched their career goals. But there was also discussion by both the service users and the employment advisors about how sometimes that new job needed to be this stepping stone job or a recovery job, which they could, move into, build up their confidence, and potentially move on after they feeling better. For those that were for working, the things that EAs were able to help them put in place were workplace action plans and reasonable adjustments. In some cases, EAs were supporting people through grievance processes, though they're very clear that they're not able to give direct legal advice. For those off sick, the EAs were supporting them with a negotiated return, and in some cases this could be a lower responsibility job or lower hours, or just moving things around to make that return to work more easy. It's also important to highlight that even though they might be providing people with support around engaging with their employer, change might not be possible in those circumstances. We heard about accounts where managers or employers weren't going to make those reasonable adjustments and meet those requests. So EAs were also having important conversations with service users about managing their expectations about what could be changed at work, making people better informed of their legal rights and duties of an employer, and maybe starting in some cases to have that discussion about whether that employment situation is right for them and they might need to move on. For those that were unemployed, as well as an employment outcome moving into work, there were other outcomes that we also saw and were described to us by the EAs. So people moved into training, and some people also said that they felt more able to job search independently. and had improved confidence around job searching and were hopeful that they would move into a job in the future. And so sort of on top of those employment outcomes that we could potentially be expected from an employment advice service, what was also clear in our interviews with the service users is that they felt that the EA had provided them with this emotional well-being support. Some described that they felt that the EA had helped with seeing an EA had helped with their anxiety and depression. What was really important to a lot of people is feeling heard and having their experiences at work validated by a third party, so not a friend or a family member, but this professional. Others described feeling more hopeful. Many people described improved confidence in their skills and abilities. Some people also talked about how CNA helped combat their social isolation. So for some people, coming into Talking Therapies, coming into the EA, they were not really seeing friends, family, or going to work. So actually having someone that they were regularly seeing was really helping them with their social isolation. EAs also, some people also described how the EAs helped establish a routine and accountability. So particularly for people who were unemployed, who were struggling to complete job applications and feeling quite low about their situation, the EA support sort of helped them, establish a routine of, okay, I'm going to apply for, 5 jobs a week, and this is when I'm going to do it. And that sort of helped build their confidence over time and led to this sense of progress. And these quotes that we've sort of got here on this slide sort of illustrate some of these experiences and what I've just talked to about. So I won't read them out, but I'm happy to share these slides so that people can have a look through them. Now, the final thing I'm going to focus on before I stop, and then hopefully we've got lots of time for questions, because it's really interesting to hear what people's reflections are on what we've done so far, is that whilst in the interviews that we've done so far, we heard a lot about very positive experiences of the EA services, but there are some clear limitations and barriers to these positive outcomes. Now, I'm not sure how many of people on this call are aware, but there is some uncertainty about the EA service continuing to be funded. And what that has meant at the moment is that services are in a position where there is a hiring freeze on EAs. So as you can imagine, we're doing these interviews in this climate, and so we're really hearing about what an impact that is having on staff. So the hiring freeze has meant for some services when they've not got enough staff to match the support that's coming through, and that is creating a strain on services. For some services, this means that wait lists are, at the moment, they're going up. But really importantly as well, this uncertainty about the future of the service is really impacting staff's mental well-being. And a few people have mentioned this sort of irony of providing support around employment when they themselves are in precarious employment situations. So it certainly is challenging, and it is having an impact on staff. The other thing that was talked about, and this was again by both service users and staff, is that the EAs can only do so much in what can be quite an Lorraine has just commented there about morale being low. Yeah, we're seeing that everywhere, Lorraine, and it is a really hard time for services. So yeah, on to my next point, which is that there are wider employer and labour market issues that with the best will in the world, these things are very hard to change. So like I mentioned previously, EAs were coming up against some employers that were not willing to make things like reasonable adjustments depending on the circumstances and the situation. And this wasn't necessarily fixed as well. I spoke to one woman whose original manager was happy to make her reasonable adjustments, all looked well, her manager changed and that manager wasn't happy. So it's not even the employee, it can just be those individual relationships, which means that things don't happen that need to happen to support someone's return to work. In the other issues that EAs were coming up against, and this is especially our EAs who are based in rural locations, as local labour markets were very challenging. And for recent graduates, they also described about how the number of graduate jobs are declining, and that was a concern for them. And the final sort of limitation and barrier that I just wanted to mention is that sometimes people's service users' personal experiences, that what was going on for them outside of work was creating a barrier that did mean that either returning to work or returning to certain types of work or not being able to work the number of hours they wanted to work just meant that at that time that was not possible. So people who had caring responsibilities that were increasing at that point, going into a full-time job was not possible. So maybe contract work would be more ideal. So there was some, and I think EAs, we can see in the interviews how EAs did their best to work with people's personal situations, but in most situations they don't. Also, I've got a question from Robert about training, but that is the end of my slides. So just to flag here that we've got a website where you can look at the other work packages and what the wider project is doing, and you can also follow us on LinkedIn to get any updates about the project. But what I will do is stop sharing the slides and then start to answer some of the questions, because I can see that some have already popped in the chat.